Okay, so, you know, sometimes like you just get hit with this wave of anxiety. It's
Yeah.
like everyone's felt that at some point.
Oh,
You
for
get
sure.
This week, we're kind of diving into something that might like offer a little comfort in those moments.
Okay.
There's this blog post, right? And it's called, get this, 25 Comforting Bible Verses for Overcoming Anxiety and Finding Peace.
Hmm.
It's by this guy, Amjad Izhar, and he just published it like a few days ago, September 30th, 2024.
Right.
And I know what you're thinking, the Bible, seriously,
Wow.
but trust me on this. Even if you're like not really a religious person, there's actually some seriously interesting stuff in here.
You're totally right. That whole search for peace thing is like been around forever. And the thing is, the Bible, whether you believe it or not, has some pretty timeless wisdom about dealing with all those anxieties life throws at you, which, let's be honest, is something we could all use a little more of these days.
Oh, 100%. And like some of these verses, they don't mess around. They go straight to the point, like do not be anxious.
Yeah.
Okay, easier said than done, right?
Right.
This one's from Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 through 34. What's the deal there? What was Jesus even talking about?
So imagine this. Jesus is with his disciples, and they're like freaking out about everyday stuff, food, clothes, having a place to live.
Yeah, relatable.
Totally.
Yeah.
And Jesus is like, yo, look at the birds. They don't stress about planting or harvesting, but your heavenly Father takes care of them. Don't you think you're worth more than a vote?
Yeah.
It's about, like, trusting that there's a bigger picture, like some kind of divine plan or whatever you want to call it.
I don't know. That whole don't worry thing has always kind of been a struggle for me.
Yeah.
It almost feels impossible, you know?
All right.
But are you saying it's more about like shifting your focus? Less about the worries themselves and more about something bigger than us?
Exactly. And there's actually research on that,
Yeah.
like letting go of control, sometimes surrendering to something outside of ourselves can actually make us less anxious.
Mm.
Yeah. And faith, like, that's a powerful tool for that. Not about pretending the problems aren't there, but approaching them with a different mindset.
Yeah.
One that's like rooted in trust and hope.
So it's less about like never feeling anxious and more about how we react to it.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. Okay, another verse that like totally stood out to me, and this is a classic even for people who aren't religious, is peace I leave with you.
Oh, yeah.
John chapter 14, verse 27. So what kind of peace are we even talking about here? Because it just feels different from like, chilling on the beach with a good book.
Right, right, yeah. And you're totally spot on. This isn't about everything being perfect on the outside, no problems, no stress. It's about inner peace, like that deep down calmness that comes from, faith and trust. It's about finding that sense of quiet confidence, even when everything around you feels chaotic.
So less about what's happening externally and more about like our internal state of being.
Exactly.
I like that. I mean, we've all had those times when everything seems fine on the surface, but our minds are racing, right?
Totally.
So this piece Jesus is talking about, it's like deeper than that, like a source of resilience or something, no matter what's going on around us.
Yes, precisely. It's about cultivating that inner space, that sanctuary, where fear and worry, like they lose their power over you. And that's such a powerful concept, even if you're not approaching it from a religious angle.
Now, speaking of finding that comfort when things are crazy, we can't forget one of the most famous passages out there, "The Lord is my shepherd," from Psalm 23.1.
Right.
Why do you think that image, God as a shepherd, why is it so universally comforting, especially when it comes to anxiety?
That's a really good question. And I think it speaks to this like really basic human need for security. Like to have someone there to guide us and protect us, especially when we feel lost or alone or just totally vulnerable.
Yeah.
And when anxiety hits, it can feel like, like you're drowning in uncertainty, right?
Totally.
But then like this song comes along and it reminds us that we're not alone.
Yeah.
That there's this force out there, this like guiding presence that's leading us to calmer waters.
It's funny how that image of a shepherd connects to like what we know about attachment theory too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like even as adults, that feeling of being safe and secure is so important for managing anxiety.
Absolutely. It all circles back to that need for connection, for belonging, for knowing we're not going through these challenges alone.
It's no wonder this psalm has stuck with people for like centuries. It's that feeling of having someone there to protect you, like a guide in the dark. And it really speaks to something deep within us,
Yeah.
Okay, there's this other verse from this post that really resonated with me. It's, "He will sustain you," from Psalm 55.22. And this one just, it feels so relevant to that feeling of being totally overwhelmed. Like you're barely keeping your head above water.
It does.
Like that feeling of like, there's that lifeline there when you feel like you're going to go under. That sense of being like supported and held up, even when you don't think you can do it anymore. And I feel like someone who's struggling with anxiety, like they could find so much comfort in those words.
Totally.
So not just that someone's gonna like help, but that you're actually being sustained, like prevented from like falling apart.
Right. And that feeling of being sustained, like it doesn't have to be, limited to just a relationship with God or anything. Think about those times when like a friend, a family member, even a stranger, like offers a kind word or gives you a helping hand. Those little acts of love and support, they can be so sustaining too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sometimes just knowing that you're not alone in it, that's huge.
Exactly.
It's like they say shared joy is a double joy and shared sorrow is half a sorrow.
I love that.
But okay, there are a couple more verses I want to unpack before we move on.
Joey?
Because they offer like really practical advice, even for those of us who maybe aren't like super religious.
Let's hear it.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's always amazing to me how these old texts can still have so much relevance for our lives today.
Right. Okay, so this next verse, it really speaks to me. Philippians 4.67, anxious for nothing.
Right.
Okay, full disclosure, I am anxious about a lot of things. So this whole like anxious for nothing idea, a little ambitious maybe,
Yeah.
but I'm open to it. So what's the wisdom here?
I love this one because it's so practical.
Okay.
It's about what you do, not just what you think. Paul, the guy who wrote this letter to the Philippians, he's basically saying, hey, instead of letting worry eat you alive, talk to God about it. Like, bring your requests to him,
Yeah. Okay.
But he doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
He's like, and hey, don't forget to be thankful for what you do have.
Oh, okay.
It's like a 1-2 punch to anxiety.
Yeah.
First, you acknowledge it, and then you shift your focus to gratitude.
Gratitude. See, you don't need an ancient text to tell you that being grateful is good for you.
Right.
But honestly, when those anxious thoughts are swirling around in your head, gratitude is like the last thing you're thinking about.
So true.
Yeah.
But that's the thing about it. You have to choose it.
Yeah.
And there's actually a ton of research on how, like, focusing on the good, even the little things, can make a real difference in our mental health,
Yeah.
It's like you're hitting the reset button in your brain, taking a step back from all that worry and choosing it to focus on something a little brighter.
It's like, yeah, changing the channel in your mind from like anxiety central to something a little more, I don't know, hopeful.
Exactly.
Okay, another one of these verses that really jumped out at me. Perfect love casts out fear. 1 John 4.18.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, talk about a powerful statement.
Right.
But like, how do we actually live that? How do we tap into that kind of love, especially when we're feeling anxious?
Man, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think it starts with understanding that this perfect love, it can come from a lot of places.
Okay.
It could be that connection to something bigger than us,
Mm-hmm.
that feeling of being completely loved and accepted for who we are. But it can also be like the love we share with other people, the love of family, our friends, our partners,
Oh, yeah.
And don't underestimate the power of self-love either.
Yes. Self-love. That is so crucial, especially when it comes to anxiety.
Right.
We are so hard on ourselves.
Or worse.
Like all that negative self-talk does is feed the anxiety monster.
Yeah.
So, yeah, remembering to be kind to ourselves, show ourselves some compassion, that's huge.
It's everything. Think about it. If you had a friend who was super stressed out,
Yeah.
you wouldn't be like yelling at them for it, right?
No.
You'd offer comfort. You'd encourage them. You'd try to understand. We've got to give ourselves that same grace, especially when those anxious thoughts come knocking.
That is so true. So I have to ask, you've obviously felt that weight of anxiety yourself at some point. What speaks to you from these verses? Like, what's your biggest takeaway? I think what really gets me is how these verses, even though they're, from a religious text, they have these universal truths, like they go beyond any one religion or belief system,
Yeah.
It's about remembering that we're all connected to something bigger than ourselves, whether that's, God or nature or the people around us, or heck, even just tapping into our own inner strength.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I find so hopeful about all of this,
It's like these verses are reminding us that we already have what we need to find that peace, even in the middle of everything going crazy.
Right.
It's just about like remembering and tapping into it, right?
Exactly.
And, we've only like scratched the surface of this blog post, but It feels like we've already uncovered so much. It's actually kind of amazing how a few short verses can lead to such a deep conversation, right?
Yeah.
Totally.
And, like, isn't that what this whole deep dive thing is all about? Taking these, like, profound ideas and, like, making them accessible, like, so we can actually relate to them and use them in our own lives.
Totally. It's like bridging the gap,
Mm.
between these ancient bits of wisdom and the anxieties we face today. It's about finding those timeless truths that still have meaning,
Mhm.
even in our crazy, fast-paced, often totally overwhelming world, And you know what I love about what you do?
What's that?
You bring this like infectious enthusiasm to these topics,
Mm.
this genuine curiosity that's just contagious.
Oh, stop it.
I'm serious. It makes these discussions so engaging and so relatable.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that.
Of course.
And hopefully our listeners feel that too.
Yeah.
Like that sense of discovery, that aha moment when something just clicks and makes
I
sense.
love it.
It's one thing to just talk about these verses, right?
Right.
But I'm always curious about like the practical stuff.
Yeah.
What can we actually do with this information?
Right.
And like, thankfully, Amjad must have read our minds because he actually includes some extra resources at the end of his blog post.
Perfect. Like
For
what?
dealing with anxiety specifically.
Yeah.
He mentions a couple of books. I've actually heard good things about both of them. Anxious for Nothing by Max Lucado, and then The Anxiety Cure by Dr. Archibald Hart.
Oh, yeah. Both really good choices.
Yeah.
So Max Lucado, he's coming at it from like a faith-based approach to dealing with anxiety, whereas Dr. Hart, he's got more of a like holistic thing going on where he's looking at anxiety from those psychological and spiritual angles.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I love about this whole topic. It's not like one or the other.
Totally.
You can find like comfort and guidance from these verses, but then also benefit from like more modern therapeutic approaches at the same time.
Exactly. It's about finding what works for you as an individual,
Right.
what helps you cultivate that peace and resilience we've been talking about. And sometimes that means, pulling from different sources, finding that balance between like, ancient wisdom and modern science.
It's like, yeah, it's like you're building your own like personal toolkit for dealing with anxiety.
I love that.
You've got your faith, you've got therapy, you've got your self-care, like whatever helps you, get through those rough waters.
Yes. Building that toolkit is so essential because, let's face it, anxiety, it's part of life. It's really all about how we respond to it.
That is such a good point. And that actually brings me to my final question for you.
Okay.
If you could ask Amjad, the author of the blog post, one question, just one, about all this, what would it be?
As we've been talking about these verses, I keep thinking about like really listening to our anxiety. So I think I'd ask him, if our anxiety could talk, what would it tell us it needs?
Whoa. That's a good question. So instead of just trying to shut those anxious thoughts down, what if we actually took a minute to listen to them?
Yeah.
What if we're like, okay, anxiety, what are you trying to tell me?
Right. Like maybe it's saying, hey, I need a break, or I need to connect with someone, or even just, be nice to me for a minute.
That is such a good point to end on. So listeners, if your anxiety could talk, what would it say? Hit us up on social media. Let us know. This deep dive has given me so much to think about. And honestly, I have a feeling I'm going to be coming back to these verses whenever I need a little dose of hope and peace. Until next time, everyone, it's like you're building your own like personal toolkit for dealing with anxiety.
I love that.
You've got your faith, you've got therapy, you've got your self-care, like whatever helps you, get through those rough waters.
Yes. Building that toolkit is so essential because, let's face it, anxiety, it's part of life. It's really all about how we respond to it.
That is such a good point. And that actually brings me to my final question for you. If you could ask Amjad, the author of the blog post, one question, just one, about all this, what would it be?
As we've been talking about these verses, I keep thinking about like really listening to our anxiety. So I think I'd ask him, if our anxiety could talk, what would it tell us it needs?
Whoa. That's a good question. So instead of just trying to shut those anxious thoughts down, what if we actually took a minute to listen to them?
Yeah.
What if we're like, okay, anxiety, what are you trying to tell me?
Right. Like maybe it's saying, hey, I need a break, or I need to connect with someone, or
Yeah.
even just, be nice to me for a minute.
That is such a good point to end on. So listeners, if your anxiety could talk, what would it say? Hit us up on social media. Let us know. This deep dive has given me so much to think about. And honestly, I have a feeling I'm going to be coming back to these verses whenever I need a little dose of hope and peace. Until next time, everyone,